For this lecture, we're going to cover Introduction to Environmental Science and Sustainability. During this section, we're going to define environmental science, look at the interdisciplinary nature, how it combines biology, chemistry, geology, and sociology together. We'll look at the scientific method and scientific inquiry. We'll discuss environmental ethics and environmental justice, and we'll do an overview of global versus local issues. Environmental science is more than just studying nature. It's about understanding the interactions between humans and the natural world. This means looking at how we depend on natural systems and how we impact them, how we can work towards solutions. Think of it like a bridge between science and society. We're not just observing these ecosystems, we're asking how do our personal choices affect the world we live in, and what can we do differently to improve those conditions? To do this, we're going to use a three-step process. First, we want to understand Earth's natural process. How do the things like climate change, water cycles, and biodiversity function? Next, we examine our impact, looking at things like pollution and resource use to land development. Finally, we explore sustainable options. So, thinking about the ways that we live, we want to have enough resources for our current generation, but we also want to make sure that we don't exploit those resources and deprive future generations. We want them to have the same prosperity we do and the same quality of life, if not better. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about balance. So it's about producing enough resources for today to meet the food, energy, and material needs of the next generation, and making sure that we don't damage those systems that the future generations will rely on. So, one question you should probably ask yourself: what does sustainability look like in your life? Is it the food you eat, the type of energy that you use, the waste you produce? These are all kinds of environmental questions science helps us answer. So, if you were eating a very unsustainable diet, what changes could you make within your own means? I want to emphasize that within your own means. If you're disposing of waste products and it's not being done in the most sustainable way, what steps could you make in your life to get to something more sustainable? Not necessarily 100%. We're not talking about being perfect, but finding those ways that we can work within our means to make small change. Environmental science is not a single discipline, it's a blend of many different fields. Solving these environmental problems is going to require a lot of collaboration across biology, chemistry, geology, and sociology. With that being said, collaboration is definitely a big part of this. So I encourage you all to practice these collaboration skills early while you're still in college. It will really help you throughout your careers. Okay, let's break this down. Biology helps us to understand ecosystems, biodiversity, and species interactions. So, for example, how do how does deforestation affect wildlife? Chemistry is also important for studying pollution, toxicity, water or air chemistry. Think about chemical reactions that happen in the atmosphere, which led to acid rain or smog. These would be studied through chemistry. Geology gives us insight into soil and natural resources, land formations, natural disasters. How can we understand these things like earthquakes? Why do earthquakes happen? How did they impact resources? Um, Especially those resources that are necessary for us to survive. And finally, sociology. This is about human behavior, things like policy, equity, community impacts. Environmental issues are not just scientific, they're social. Who gets access to clean water? Who bears the burden of the pollution if it gets into the water? Combining all of these, we can create these solutions that are scientifically sound but socially fair. There's two major forms of science that we're going to look at. The first is basic. This is where we're studying something because we're curious about it. We don't really have a goal for studying this other than curiosity, but that information can later lead to what's called applied science, where we use that knowledge already gained to solve real world problems. So, an example of basic science would be just studying how cells divide. For applied science, it would be developing drought resistant crops. So, with applied science, we actually have a goal of something that we're going to use to solve a problem. If you've ever gone onto social media and seen really obscure sounding research papers, and people are like, that's a total waste of money. Why would they study something like that? It's so pointless. A lot of these have actually led to really useful information. For example, studying bioluminescence in jellyfish. This was seen as just a novelty, a curiosity. Back in the 90s, it became really popular where they injected fish with it and they would sell them in grocery stores, and everyone thought it was really cool. But this led to the discovery of green fluorescent protein. And this was used in medical research to track the spread of cancer and HIV in real time. So it became incredibly important. Another example is shrimp on a treadmill. This research paper was mocked as a symbol of wasteful spending, but the research was designed to study how environmental stress from climate change affects economically important marine species. Shrimp is an economically important marine species. So if we were to do something like having them run on treadmills, this would give a good example of what kind of impact that stress would have. And if we knew that climate change was causing similar stress and it could cause the shrimp population to decline, that can affect the economy. Another example is bird watching. There was a researcher who noticed that kingfishers made very little splash when they hit the water. So as they dive down, usually birds will hit the water and you'll see a nice big splash. With kingfishers, they barely make any splash at all. He ended up applying the shape of that bird's beak to the design of the bullet train, which is highly popular throughout the rest of the world. So the reason he wanted to create this design, when trains would come out of tunnels, they would create this very loud booming sound. And obviously booming sounds not good for hearing, but if you live in those areas, it's going to wake you up. It's going to disrupt your life. A lot of areas throughout the world, especially if they had encountered war times, this could be a very triggering sound as those trains came out of the tunnels. So by creating the bullet train, it completely eliminated that problem. Environmental science relies heavily on the scientific method because we're dealing with very complex real world problems here. It starts with observing a phenomenon. Maybe we notice a local fish population is starting to die off, or we see an increase in air pollution in a local area. Next, we're going to ask ourselves a question. Why is this happening? What factors are involved in this? This step is really crucial because it can guide the entire investigation. We're actually using it to work towards a specific goal. Then we form a hypothesis. This is a testable explanation. That key word is testable. For example, we might hypothesize that fish decline is due to an increase in temperature from climate change. We can test the temperature and see if that has an actual impact on it. It's something that's actually testable. After that, we experiment and collect our data. This usually means doing field work, sampling water quality, using GIS for mapping, or running computer models or simulations. There's a number of different tools that some of them you can learn here at the college, some of them you'll learn on your own, some of them you'll acquire throughout your career. I very much encourage you to start building your toolbox of skills as early as possible because that will help you later on when you start looking for a job. Once we have the data, we're going to analyze it. Does it support our hypothesis? Are there patterns or anomalies? This is where statistics and modeling come into play. So, for those of you who thought you were just going to get away and not have to do any kind of math in this course, you will definitely need some statistics. Environmental science relies on that. Any scientific field, you're going to need to use statistics. This is where we're actually confirming if our hypothesis is valid or not. Finally, we draw a conclusion. If the hypothesis is supported, we can use that knowledge to inform policy or develop solutions. If not, we can just refine our hypothesis and test again. Environmental inquiry is unique because it often combines the fieldwork, experiments, GIS modeling. It's not a lab-based science. It's applied science. So it's aimed at solving those real-world problems. Once we've completed our initial investigation to determine what causes that problem, we'll test out those solutions and see if they work successfully or not. Now we're going to talk about three terms that tend to get used interchangeably but have very different meanings. First is hypothesis. This is a testable explanation for an observation. Usually, we're going to design our study around this hypothesis. So the way that we study it is going to determine if the evidence supports it or if it rejects it. So one example of this would be increasing nitrogen fertilizer. Is it going to increase crop yields? We could say, I think that increasing this nitrogen fertilizer will increase the crop yields. And then you would design your study, and once you've collected your data and done your data analysis, that would tell you if it would support or reject your hypothesis. Now, a theory is a very broad, well-supported explanation of a natural phenomenon. And usually it's been tested repeatedly, it's been confirmed, it has good, solid evidence that it is in fact supported by multiple studies that used hypothesis. So you start with the hypothesis for one test, you collect your overwhelming large body of evidence based on multiple hypotheses that came to the same conclusion, and it becomes a theory. Now, a law is a little different. It describes consistent patterns that usually are in the form of mathematical calculations. So this is going to tell us what happens, but it doesn't explain why. So one example would be Newton's law of gravity or law of conservation of energy. This is a mathematical equation, and it's been used and tested for a very long time. Why it occurs? The law itself does not tell us. So that would be where we would lead to further research and develop more hypotheses and then develop a theory that could explain the law. But as the law exists mathematically, it is considered to be accurate. For one of your assignments, you're going to be calculating your own ecological footprint. So what does this mean? An ecological footprint measures how much impact a person, product, organization, or activity has on the environment. It looks at everything put into making that product or making those decisions or lifestyle, and all of the different types of pollution that go into it. If we look at a real world example, let's say we want to find out the ecological footprint of a hamburger. We would consider growing the feed to feed the crops. That would include the crops for all the vegetables on that burger, your tomatoes, your lettuce, your onions. If you want to put mushrooms, that's going to go in there as well. The water required. You also have the water that's required to feed your cattle. Because if it has beef on there on the burger, you're raising cattle, which is another expense because you also have methane emissions from that. You have to transport the animals and the meat and the vegetables. You have processing and refrigeration to make sure that they don't go bad. You have packaging. So if you look at the packages, the foam containers or the plastic covering, the labels that go onto them. And then the energy required to cook at home. Are you using electricity? Are you using gas? Are you using a charcoal grill? Those all have different calculations as far as energy use. And then the disposal of leftovers. We waste a lot of food, and sometimes we don't eat all of our product. So how much of that food gets wasted? These are all included into the calculations. And there's no way to really get perfect, but we can create models that can give us a good enough estimate to provide us with the information to make an educated decision about how we live. So if we decide, yeah, the ecological footprint of this hamburger is a little too high for my liking, maybe I should think about portion sizes. If I'm disposing of products, maybe I should, make half of a burger and then I'll have leftovers for tomorrow. Or if you're thinking about transportation, is there a local butcher that you would be able to purchase from? Or maybe if you got a couple vegetables together and made a bean burger once in a while, that would help lower that ecological footprint. But these are all choices that individuals would have to make. And corporations do the same. You have a board that gets together, they might assign a committee to look into ecological footprints of their products, and they might decide, hey, maybe we should do better. And a lot of companies have. Starbucks over the years has tested and developed a lot of different products to be more sustainable. So there's been a lot of controversy about their plastic and their cups. They did do an analysis on that and determined that they kind of met in between. So rather than going full paper, they reduced the amount of plastic in their products and opted for one that was safer for their customers so that they wouldn't burn their mouths. So you might not be able to get completely sustainable in that respect, but you might be able to find some middle ground. Old Navy is another company. They were very popular back in the 90s, and in the 2000s, they noticed their customers were going for more sustainable products. So they looked into water reduction. So their denim actually doesn't use as much water as it used to. They looked into buying more sustainable products and looking at the quality of those products, how the farms actually practice. So when they grow the cotton, what are they actually doing? What's their ecological footprints? A lot of companies do this, and we don't really think about it. So it's a good idea every once in a while, if you like a product, see if they have a sustainability plan. See if they've measured their ecological footprint. If there's a company you're interested in, maybe their products cost a little more, but they have a lower ecological footprint. And again, those are decisions that we have to make for ourselves based on the information that we have and our own ethical values. I personally find environmental ethics to be very fascinating. At its core, ethics is simply the framework we use to make decisions. It often gets confused with morality, but ethics is more about the decision-making systems that we create for ourselves and as societies. So when we talk about environmental ethics, we're talking about how we create frameworks to make decisions that affect the environment. Environmental ethics shows up in some really unexpected places too. If anyone here is a fan of anime, environmental ethics is a really common theme. When I was working on my master's project, I came across a paper that analyzed the anime Weathering with You and its connection to climate change. That really caught my attention. So I decided to look deeper. For my final project in that course, I ended up referencing 12 different anime series and films. This shows that environmental ethics isn't just an academic idea, it appears in pop culture all around us. Another place we see environmental ethics is in public policy. A lot of the time, we read news articles and feel frustrated or upset about environmental decisions made by policymakers. But we often don't stop to ask why those decisions were made. A lot of the time, decisions are based on different ethical frameworks and assumptions. Every person and every policymaker has a different ethical framework. Understanding those differences can actually be helpful. If you're trying to solve an environmental problem, learning how someone else thinks and what they value can help you find common ground. This is what many advocates and negotiators spend their entire lives doing, working with policymakers to find solutions that move everyone just far enough towards a shared goal. Sometimes finding common ground is easy, and sometimes it requires a lot of compromise. For example, an animal rights group might want a particular piece of land protected. Hunters might seem like an unlikely ally, But they may also want that land conserved so it can be used in the future. Even though their motivations are different, both groups can agree on protecting that land. There's many types of environmental ethics. These are not the only ones, but they are some important examples. One is intrinsic value, which is the idea that nature has a value simply because it exists, not because of how humans use it. Another is precautionary principle. This approach says that if an action could cause serious harm or irreversible harm to the environment, we should take precautions. Even if we don't fully understand the cause and effect of the relationship, in other words, we protect first and ask questions later. There's ecocentrism, which argues that the entire ecosystem, living and non-living, has a moral value. If you've ever heard discussions about the rights of nature, those ideas are based on ecocentrism. Another ethical approach is stewardship, which says that humans have a moral responsibility to act as caretakers to the earth and to protect and sustain it. I strongly encourage you to explore different ethical principles and think about your own personal framework. You may come across some ethical principles that resonate with you enough to influence how you make your decisions. This is a great way to learn more about who you are and what you value. For this course, we will focus on 4 main environmental ethics. The first is frontier ethics. It's based on the idea that natural resources are limited and exist only for human use. This mindset was common during the westward expansion in the United States. Forests were cleared, wildlife was hunted, and resources like coal and gold were extracted with little concern for any long-term effects. The result was overuse, habitat loss, and environmental degradation. One well-known example of this near extinction was the American bison. Next is land ethics, developed by Aldo Leopold. Leopold argued that humans are a part of a larger community that includes soil, water, plants, and animals. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate from nature, land ethics encourages respect and care for the land. Examples include restoring wetlands or planting native vegetation, actions that improve ecosystems rather than simply extracting them. Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, had a major influence on conservation thinking when it came to the creation of protected land. Interestingly, Theodore Roosevelt also supported conservation, but for a different reason. Roosevelt was a big game fan, and his motivation for protecting land was to preserve areas for hunting. This shows how those different ethical frameworks can still lead to the same outcome, environmental protection. The third principle is sustainable ethics. This focuses on long-term balance. The goal is to meet today's needs without preventing future generations from meeting theirs. Examples include renewable energy like solar and wind, recycling materials, and managing fisheries so populations can recover. The key ideas here are responsibility, fairness, and renewability. Finally, we have the tragedy of commons. This concept describes what happens when shared resources like fisheries, grazing land, or even the atmosphere are overused because individuals act in their own short-term interest. For example, if every fisher tries to catch as many fish as possible, fish populations will collapse and everyone loses. We see this today with overfishing, deforestation, and air pollution. Solutions to this problem usually involve cooperation and setting limits. It can include regulations, community agreements, or stewardship programs. For example, Florida Fish and Wildlife sets fishing quotas every year to prevent overfishing. Many countries also set emission limits to protect air quality and reduce climate change. Historically, Marginalized and indigenous communities have faced disproportionate shares of environmental harm. This includes pollution, resource extraction, and the loss of land. This image was taken in Alert Bay, which was originally called Yalis. It's located on Cormorant Island off the northern coast of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. The area is home to the Namgish First Nation, who are part of the larger Kwakwakwa culture. The Namgish people have lived in this region for thousands of years. During that time, they managed land and water in a sustainable way. Many of their traditions are still practiced today, including the potlucky. The potlucky is a really important ceremonial gathering. It involves large celebrations that recognize social status, marriage, or any significant event in life. During these ceremonies, the community members bring excess resources and redistribute them throughout the community. This system creates a fair, equitable, and sustainable way of sharing resources. Instead of individuals holding on to more than they need, resources were shared with others. And this reduces the pressure on the environment because people did not need to over extract natural resources to create unnecessary excess. The potlucky remains a deeply important tradition for these people today. The traditional territory of the Namgish includes the Nimkish and Kokish River watersheds. Their cultural crest is a sea monster called Namgis Gigam. The crest comes from an origin story involving a great flood. According to the story, the creator warned a man that a flood was coming and told him to meet a powerful sea monster by the ocean. Heavy rain caused the water levels to rise, and the sea monster was so large that it pushed the tides away from the land. The man climbed onto the monster's head and was carried away for a long time. Eventually, the tides turned and caused a devastating flood. When the man came back, everyone in his village had died. Feeling deeply alone, he transformed birds into humans, which became the Namgish people. Because of this story, the people are strongly connected to both the land and the sea. Their crest represents that relationship and symbolizes their deep connection with nature. During colonization, much of their land was degraded. Many of their cultural practices, including the potlucky, were banned. In this image, you can see traditional totem poles in the background, but also a tombstone with a Christian cross. That cross was likely placed there during the 18th or 19th century, although the exact date's unknown because the burial grounds are protected now and cannot be disturbed. During this period, traditional regalia was made illegal and indigenous children were forced into residential schools. In these schools, children were not taught their traditional ecological knowledge or cultural practices. The school in this region operated until the mid-1990s, around 1996. The conditions in these schools were extremely harsh. Many children became sick or died. The guiding ideology was often described as killing the Indian in the child, which meant destroying indigenous culture through forced assimilation, or in many cases, physical harm. It caused immense trauma and loss of families and communities. While some traditions like the potlucky survived in secret, much of the cultural knowledge was erased. This includes traditional ecological knowledge about land stewardship and sustainable resource use. Since then, the school has been torn down and replaced with a cultural center, where efforts are being made to restore language, traditions, and cultural practices. Globally, indigenous people make up only about 5% of the world population, yet they manage or protect around 80% of the world's biodiversity. This is just one snapshot of a single community, but it reflects a much larger global scale. Much of the world's remaining undeveloped land is managed by indigenous communities. These communities hold generations of knowledge about how to survive sustainably within their environment. Understanding environmental justice means recognizing how environmental harm disproportionately affects these communities. It also acknowledges the value of traditional ecological knowledge when making environmental decisions today. In many cases, these are not only more sustainable practices, but also more cost effective. And governments often benefit from them. The resources become more abundant and accessible for everyone. In the case of the Nimkish people, they're now working with the Canadian government to help restore salmon populations and to protect sacred lands for sustainable and biodiversity purposes. The last topic we're going to talk about is the difference between local and global environmental issues. When we talk about environmental problems, it's important to recognize that they happen at different scales. Local environmental issues affect specific community regions. Examples include littering, illegal dumping in neighborhoods, urban flooding caused by poor drainage systems, air pollution from nearby factories, or waste contamination in local rivers. These problems usually have an immediate effect on human health and the quality of life. Because local issues are often visible and easy to notice, communities and local governments can usually address them more directly. They're hard to ignore, which often leads to fast action. On the other hand, global environmental issues affect the entire planet. These include climate change, ocean pollution, deforestation, habitat loss, biodiversity loss. Global issues are more difficult to solve because they are interconnected and involve many countries, communities, and ecosystems. For example, climate change isn't caused by emissions from just one city or country. It's a result of cumulative emissions worldwide. Solving global environmental problems usually requires both global and local cooperation. International agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement set global goals. However, their success depends on local action, such as cities reducing emissions and communities adopting sustainable practices. Small local action adds up to global progress. These issues are not always straightforward. Sometimes a country may appear to be reducing its emissions based on local data, but that doesn't tell the whole story. In some cases, emissions are simply being produced somewhere else. This is known as carbon leakage or exported emissions. For example, when a community imports manufactured goods from another country, the carbon emissions from producing and transporting those goods happen outside the local area. However, those emissions they still exist because of local consumption. A real-world example comes from the United Kingdom. Between 1993 and 2010, emissions from the UK domestic industry decreased. Carbon dioxide emissions dropped by about 5%, and overall greenhouse gas emissions dropped by about 14%. However, emissions produced overseas to meet the UK's demands increased dramatically by about 59% for carbon dioxide and 38% for greenhouse gases. So while it looked like the UK was reducing emissions, a large portion of those emissions were simply being produced elsewhere. The global impact didn't decrease, it shifted geographically. This shows why it's important to look beyond local data in evaluating environmental success. Even if local emissions appear lower, global emissions may remain the same or even increase. One thing I encourage you to do is to learn more about your local area. Try to identify the environmental problems in your community, what they face, and the solutions that are already being worked on. For example, both Pinellas and Hillsborough County have sustainability action plans that outline local goals and strategies. Getting involved at local levels is a great place to start. You can help by participating in community efforts, volunteering, or even interning with organizations working on environmental solutions. If you have ideas, you can also reach out to local decision makers and share your suggestions. Local action not only helps your community, it also contributes to solving those global environmental challenges. In many cases, these efforts can become a pathway for a future career.